It's the oldest rivalry in the South, and both Georgia and Auburn need a decision at the game's most important position. This and much more on this week's version of SEC Breakdown. We come your way every Wednesday night at 9 o'clock Eastern Time and 8 o'clock on the Central Time Zone. And this is the SEC Breakdown crew. Chad Niefling not here tonight. Evie Van Pelt as well, helping us out with Ole Miss in particular. But we've got David Waters and Mike Laval, along with myself, Mark Rogers, to talk up some SEC football at the beginning of May. So before we hit the record button, there was a little baseball talk, a lot of Masters talk, but we talk nothing but football right here. And talking of other sports, guys, coming off this thriller of a game in the men's basketball national championship game, Villanova upsetting North Carolina, the great shot on the Tar Heels end, followed by the improbable shot to win it at the buzzer for the Wildcats. Transitioning to football, Dave, do you have a SEC equivalent? Big game, big stage, SEC team losing when it mattered most.
When it mattered most, man, yeah, you're right. But lately, like you said, it's the SEC kind of dominated, in recent memory. But I guess if you want to pick an SEC team in a big moment, I would kind of just maybe go a different way of like SEC versus SEC, and only because I think if you go back to the 2012 SEC championship game. And how Georgia was oh so close. It's Georgia. It's been forever since they've been in a national title talk, and it's been forever since they've been in a national title game. And that was the closest they have come. And they were 5 yards short on a tip pass that if you could go back and do it, you probably don't catch it, and the clock runs. The clock doesn't run out, and you get another play. But for all those Georgia fans I know, and going into that game, they were hyped and. That was, if they win that game, they probably go on to beat Notre Dame in the national championship game. And the Georgia faithful was oh so close. But, as probably the most recent one, that one comes to mind for me.
Okay, Mike, when you think back, whether it's a situation in which it's the SEC versus the SEC, but if you're going to play by the rules, it would be the SEC versus the world. Anything come to mind in regards to an upset that the SEC suffered, or just an excruciating loss where the victory was right there on the big stage in a big game and it let it slip away?
Well, David took my first answer. That 2012 SEC championship game with Aaron Murray's pass to Chris Conley there with the time running out was just it's crushing for Georgia. If you look back at Mark Richt, the knock on Richt was he never could win championships, and that was the game. If you look at the national stage, SEC playing a non-conference opponent, I think you go back to Malzahn's first year, 2013. They're playing Florida State in the championship game. They got all the pressure of the SEC on them. I think the SEC had won maybe 7 straight national championships. You've got Nick Marshall driving those guys down the field to score. It looks like they're going to win, and then the defense kind of collapses and lets Florida State, led by Jameis Winston, come down and score pretty much on a last-second play. So Auburn's responsible for not only letting Auburn down, but letting the conference down as well, ending the streak. It was pretty crushing for Auburn. And if you look, I think we're going to talk Auburn later. They finished that year 12-2, and then 8-5, and then 7-6 last year. So that's one of those plays, that defensive let-up against Florida State in the national championship game. That might be one of those drives that signals a transition for a program for years to come. Looking back on that 2013 national championship game, that's the first thing that comes to mind after the 2012 SEC championship game. You got to start asking me some of these questions first, so David doesn't steal my answers.
Well, I was just going to say, Mike, as being a gracious host, this is where it doesn't pay off to go third, because that's the first thing that came to mind, and I've been scouring 25 years of football to come in with anything that replaces the Auburn-Florida State game, because the SEC won every BCS championship game, so you got nothing there that's on the national championship stage. Sure, you can look at some other bowl games or huge out-of-conference games to see SEC losses. Obviously, they didn't go perfect in every game, but if you're going to liken it to North Carolina Villanova and go to the national championship game, that wipes out the entire BCS era before the Auburn-Florida State game. And then I'm searching for something else, and the closest I could come up with it, and it was a complete annihilation, so it doesn't liken to the Villanova at the wire against North Carolina, is Nebraska rolling over Florida in the Fiesta Bowl after the 1995 season for the national championship, but that was just a demolition, not an excruciating loss at the wire. So that points to the success of SEC football and the dominance when you can't even come up with anything in the last 20-plus years.
Yeah, that wasn't Nebraska's first steamroll of an SEC team in a major bowl in that decade either. They steamrolled Tennessee a couple years earlier.
Yeah, and a couple years later.
Yes.
They had two of those, one at the Orange, one at the Fiesta. But, Nebraska was doing that to just about everybody at that point in time.
Yeah, I heard, just if you've had to make a personal moment out of it, I think the closest I would come to feeling like probably like a North Carolina fan felt that night was, and Mike will get a kick out of this, was the 2001 Florida-Tennessee game. That game got pushed to the end of the year because of September 11th. And both teams, whoever won that game was going to go to the SEC championship game and represent the East. And if either team wins that game, more than likely they were headed to the national championship game to play Miami. And so that game was so big, and then it was Spurrier and Fulmer, so many great games, and Florida was Tennessee comes in and just runs all over Florida, and it was not even. Yeah, Travis Stevens, Florida's defense that year was great. It was a really good defense. Travis Stevens, 226 yards and on 19 carries. And, Rex Grossman probably should have won the Heisman that year, but Tennessee came into the swamp and really handed it to Florida. And, that game was, tough for me. I thought that was probably one of Spurrier's best teams at Florida that really didn't amount to anything. It ended up being his last year as well. So it was, I don't think that game really did much to, push Spurrier out of Florida. But that game probably, for me, hurt the most.
Well, we've been paying the devil his due for a decade now, so hopefully that'll change here pretty soon.
And you talk about excruciating losses. It came that close last season from breaking the string, and 4th and 16, one of 5 fourth down conversions, as you both know very well, in the swamp last year. All right, Mike, we'll move ahead to 2016. We'll bail you out, Mike. I know you've heard and seen that so many times at this point. We'll talk some Georgia football, so we'll go with a nemesis of both of yours, and so you can both get a scowl on your face at the same time, talking about the Bulldogs. G-Day's coming up here pretty quickly. We've got a quarterback battle ensuing where, at this point, Brice Ramsey and Greyson Lambert are splitting time with the ones. Jacob Eason, despite all the talent and the hype, the 5-star status, he's basically getting the majority of his snaps with the 3s at this point. Don't know how much that means with the rest of spring ball to be played, and then especially going into August. So, Dave, we'll set you up on the Georgia situation on offense, in particular in the quarterback situation.
We're going to spring now, and it's kind of when you read spring reports, it's kind of filled with optimism. Spring is a new season, and spring practice just kind of always seems to go great. Georgia had their first scrimmage, and Eason, while leading the third team, from what I've kind of gathered so far, he really came out and impressed. Even with the third team, came out and he was making throws that you don't see many guys make just because of his pure size. He looks like a quarterback. He's 6'6", 235 pounds, and he's a man out there from what people are saying. And he's not, from what I heard, wasn't really going against only the third team defense. And he's looking like one of the best young quarterbacks to come out in a while. But this is spring practice, where everything's made to sound good, I think. But from what we heard, he was third on the depth chart going in, and then I cautioned some Georgia fans. Some of them kind of, what's wrong with Eason, or there's nothing wrong. That's pretty much expected. It's his first spring, people were panicking. And Kirby Smart's not just going to hand over the keys to a true freshman quarterback his first year. That's not going to happen. I do think maybe it eventually happens in his first season, but if it does happen, that probably means the season's not going pretty well for Georgia, and they probably need to make a quarterback change. So if you do see Eason in the first year and he's a starter, he either is really, really good, which we don't see many times from freshman quarterbacks in the SEC, or Georgia needs to make a change because the current quarterbacks aren't playing well. But saying that, that's not to say the other quarterbacks haven't looked good so far this spring. Greyson Lambert, Brice Ramsey, like you mentioned, in the scrimmage, they had some good drives and nice throws as well. The offense seemed to be ahead of the defense from what I've heard. So it'd be interesting to see how the reps getting split up if Eason continues to do well. Do whichever quarterback is second in the race, do they get relegated to third? But from what we heard, Eason is looking good, but still kind of third on the depth chart right now.
Now, going back to the bowl game against Louisville 2 years ago, in which Nick Chubb blew up against the Cardinals as he did most of that season, Brice Ramsey was spurred into action at the last minute early in that ball game. I wasn't impressed with his play in that bowl game, but again, didn't get the first team reps and wasn't necessarily prepared for that game. And I understand that Brice Ramsey can make all the throws as well, maybe not to the extent of Eason, but he's got an extremely strong arm despite what he showed us in that game. He only got 35 throws last year, completed 21, a touchdown and 2 picks. Of course, it was Greyson Lambert getting the keys to the car coming in as a transfer from Virginia. Better offensive personnel for him. He really lit it up against the inferior teams. He hit a wall against Alabama, as most guys did. But overall, 12 touchdowns to 2 picks. A very nice season for Greyson Lambert. We'll see if he can improve upon that with some questionable weapons in the passing game that we've addressed in recent weeks, Mike. So your thoughts about the Bulldogs coming into this?
Well, I think Georgia finds themselves in a situation familiar with a lot of teams in the SEC where they just don't know who's going to be under center coming up. I think to predict who's going to play quarterback at the start of the season, you really got to look at the coaches. Kirby Smart's coming from Alabama. His mentor there, the Bama head coach, Nick Saban, always looks for consistency. His offense, he would rather them not make mistakes than have tremendous blow-up plays or tremendous wow plays. So I think Kirby Smart is going to impress upon Jim Chaney, the experience factor. So I agree with David. I'm not sure you're going to see Jacob Eason start. I totally agree with David. I think it's going to be interesting to see where Eason starts on the depth chart, whether he's number 2 or number 3. I got to think he's going to be there at number 2 because even though Smart's looking for consistency and consistent solid play, he's also looking to develop and groom that top-level quarterback for the next 3 or 4 years. I had a chance to see Eason play in the Army All-American Bowl here in San Antonio. A mediocre performance, but hey, that's one game. So I think looking at the coaches, I think Jim Chaney and his system's going to play a role in this. Of course, Chaney's coming. He's been offensive coordinator for several years now. He has SEC experience through 4 years at Tennessee, Arkansas, and then Pitt last year. Chaney's interesting because he's one of the first guys that really brought spread offense to college football when he was at Purdue with Drew Brees. But then he took a 3 or 4 year stint in the NFL, and since he's come out of the NFL, he's really ran a pro-style offense there at Tennessee, Arkansas, and Pittsburgh. So I think that while the details might be different on the field, it's going to be very similar look on the field for Bulldog fans. They're going to see a pro system. It's going to be balanced, and they're going to see a good mix of passing and offense. And a lot of people don't remember that Georgia's had a lot of good running backs the last couple of years, but Georgia has always been a very balanced offense there between the passing and the running. Remember, you had Aaron Murray, you had Matt Stafford, David Green. Then going back to the 90s, you had Eric Zaire. I think Georgia's had 4 4-year starters over the last 20 years. I'm not sure any team in the nation can say that. So I think Chaney's pro-style offense is going to help two ways. One, if they go with the experience of Lambert and Ramsey, that pro-style offense is going to kind of protect them a little bit. But if they bring Eason in, it will help ease him in. So I think one of the keys to the quarterback situation is going to be the coaching situation there between Kirby Smart's philosophy and Jim Chaney's system down there in Georgia.
We are SEC Breakdown. We're undergoing a number of changes and going to let you know about a lot of specifics and details going forward. But for right now, just the important thing is we're talking SEC football each and every week, and actually each and every day. So join us on Twitter at SEC Breakdown, where we have a ton of fun talking up SEC football and getting you the instant analysis to the breaking news around the conference, and also touching upon men's basketball, women's basketball, and the other sports around the SEC. So tons of stuff to talk to you about considering our platform in future weeks. But right now, just lock it in on SEC Breakdown, and we do this every Wednesday night at 9 o'clock Eastern and 8 o'clock Central with David Waters and Mike LaValle, also on our crew, Chad Niepling and Evie Van Pelt. So before we move it from rival to rival here, David, anything else on Georgia football?
I think I'll just keep with the quarterbacks. It's kind of seen. We've talked about Brice Ramsey, and he had the big arm coming in. I got to cover him when he played at Camden County, Georgia, which is right above Jackson, the Florida Georgia line in Georgia. So it was interesting because he came from a triple option offense in high school, but was highly recruited as a passing quarterback and to go to college, and you don't see that too often. And it's kind of coming out now that while he does have the arm strength and the athleticism that we saw when he ran the triple option, it's does you have the leadership? He's not really taking control of the huddle, and Kirby Smart's made some remarks. It's not natural for him to go into the huddle and command it, and he needs to do that because it kind of like you see other people maybe noticing it, and then once your teammates notice you're a little apprehensive in the huddle, how can you lead them in front of 90,000 screaming fans, and for a last drive of a game to get a W? So there's kind of been rumors of this exact situation in the past, and maybe the previous staff never really came out and said it. But it's up to Brice Ramsey to get that mental aspect of the game and do that. History says right now he's just a backup. But he doesn't have to be the Tim Tebow rah in your face type, but he needs to show a cool demeanor and communicate with his teammates that he can be the guy.
We are lining up rivals across divisions, and the main focus, along with Alabama and Tennessee, in keeping this rotational schedule alive in the SEC, it basically comes down to Bama, Tennessee, and also this one, Georgia and Auburn, the big reason why there's an East-West crossover in matchups between those two divisions. So, Mike, let's talk some Auburn Tigers coming off a disappointing 7-6 campaign that was salvaged somewhat in terms of a winning record with a bowl victory against Paxton Lynch in Memphis. Nick Marshall, much criticized for his inability to drive the football downfield, but his sleight of hand at the quarterback position certainly key in running that football with a great offensive line and Cameron Artis-Payne and then Trey Mason prior to that. And you don't always know what you have until it's gone. And Jeremy Johnson was supposed to be the guy and stand tall in the pocket and deliver the football downfield, and he was utterly confused out of the chute last year. Sean White got some playing time as well, but Auburn just couldn't move the football on offense for most of the season. And now we come into a situation where we've got those two quarterbacks along with John Franklin vying for the starting quarterback job. And we also come from a place where we were talking coaching changes, in particular at the head coaching spot at Georgia. Now we're going to a place in Auburn that still has Gus Malzahn in place on the sideline, but all sorts of coaching changes around him.
Yeah, Mark, Auburn's in a very similar situation as Georgia. Big question mark, three-man battle for the quarterback position there, and a lot of change over the head coaching position, which is odd at Auburn because we're going into Malzahn's fourth year as head coach. Here's a stat for you. The 11 coaches on staff, they average 1.6 years of tenure at the school. You have 5 first-year assistant coaches at Auburn. That kind of stuck out to me. It's going to be interesting to see how those assistant coaches implement their styles and their systems or adapt to their coordinator on the offense's perspective during spring practice and how they connect with the guys. So that's 5 different units who are going to have to establish those relationships. Of course, new defensive coordinator Kevin Steele and keeping offensive coordinator Rhett Lashley, who is kind of the focus of a lot of the criticism from the fans coming into this year. Like I said, Malzahn started out 12-2, 8-5 the next year, and 7-6 last year. And if you look at their schedule, it's going to be tough to get to 6-6 this year. So how hot will Malzahn's seat be at the end of the year? So that's kind of the coaching situation. A lot of fans upset that they lost Demanian Craig, the wide receiver coach, former Auburn player. So there's a lot of people looking at the coaching situation there at Auburn, not very happy about it. Transitioning over to the quarterbacks, you hit on it. John Franklin III's had a lot of coaching talk, but from the couple of people I've talked to, they seem to think Jeremy Johnson's going to win this job again this year. I've heard the comments laser focused more than once about his preparation and his development this spring, and I've also heard that he's very well trusted inside the locker room. Dave just talked about leadership from Brice Ramsey. I've been told that Jeremy Johnson's leadership is what is going to win him the job as a quarterback. I've also heard that you might see John Franklin in the Wildcat, particularly against a defense like Clemson. So it looks like, from my perspective, it's a two-man race. If Jeremy Johnson can show some consistency and get that confidence, I think he'll be the starter. If not, Malzahn, kind of the opposite of Kirby Smart, he probably doesn't value consistency as much as he values the wow factor. So, of course, John Franklin III does have a shot if he can continue to demonstrate that. But I think it's a two-man race between Franklin and Johnson. I'll leave you with this. The single most important person to watch over the spring is the center. They lost two offensive tackles. They moved last year's center to tackle, and they've started they're giving first-team reps to a new center by the name of Xavier Dampier. If you've read Malzahn's book or if you studied his offense, you know how critically important the center is in that offense. Much like the NFL pro styles, the center is very much that second quarterback, very key to the coverages. And when you run that type of offense, it's all about the numbers on which side of the line determines which side the ball is going to go to. I don't want to get too football nerdy on you, but that center is a critically important position. They've changed that this year. So a lot of question marks, coaches, quarterbacks, and offensive line. It could be another tough year there on the Plains.
Yeah, well, this is the place to get football nerdy on us, Mike, so you can break that out anytime you'd like. So we're the guys that are going to listen to that. There's no doubt about it. We might have some people running for the exits online, but Dave and I will certainly listen to you. And what makes up battles and matchups more than anything are styles. And these three quarterbacks have somewhat distinct styles. Jeremy Johnson's the guy that stands tall in the pocket. He's 6'5", but he's got some athleticism to break, contain, and be a running threat. That's not what he does best, but he has to make the defense respect the run. Sean White's pretty much a standard drop-back passer that can make all the throws. He's a really good quarterback, and well, a stat that really stands out to me is he threw one touchdown in 143 pass attempts last year. That's how anemic the offense was for the Auburn Tigers, throwing the football downfield and not able to complement some really good running backs, Jovan Robinson and Peyton Barber in particular last year. And then you got now John Franklin III, the mystery guy, the guy that we've only heard about, and his skill set, which is typically dual threat, although his throwing mechanics aren't supposed to be the best, and he's really going to rely on running the football to move the ball for the Auburn Tigers if he can win the job. So, David, that sets up the big three in regards to this Auburn quarterback position, and we talked just a few minutes ago about the national championship game, but things have changed quite a bit at Auburn, and Gus Malzahn's going to really rely on the quarterback to bail him out of a hot seat there on the Plains.
And it's scary, if you think about. I think if you look at the coaches and what they have to do this spring, and Mark, you mentioned these quarterbacks do have different styles. So how much do you practice, one style, and then you switch quarterbacks, and you can't keep calling the same run plays when Franklin's behind center, when either White or Johnson are back there. So more quarterback centric run with him back there. So that changes what the receivers are doing, what the running backs are doing, to a degree. So I think it's a little bit of a play with the players as well when they have to sit there and maybe play a different style with whoever's behind center. How many right reps are they getting, and to get take that next step to save Malzahn's job, because you're right, because it's going to be on these quarterbacks. And Franklin, you mentioned where he's going to get better at throwing the ball. It was Nick Marshall came in as a converted defensive back and could throw the ball enough to make that offense dangerous. Can Franklin take that next step to at least get that good? When being able to run the ball as good as Auburn did, that left a good bit of passing lanes open, and that's why you saw wide receivers, they were running wide open, to complete passes, or they had this big receiver that you could just throw it up deep and the guys would go get the ball. So I find it interesting to see what system they may go with and how that affects the rest of the playmakers on offense. I think if they go with Sean White and Jeremy Johnson, the rotating receivers that they're going through this spring right now. We need to be utilized more. And if they go with Franklin, I think you'll see that the crazy running game that you saw just a couple of years ago. And Franklin has looked good in the scrimmage, and I'll mention the scrimmage where the quarterbacks were allowed to get hit. Malzahn took the safety jerseys off of them, and he wanted them to get a little bit of contact. But Franklin busted a 70-yard run, and that was a big surprise to everyone, they said. And it's, but Jeremy Johnson, to not be let down, he had a 75-yard touchdown pass to Rock Thomas on a wheel route. So quarterbacks are making plays, and I thought it was interesting. Yesterday at practice, Jeremy Johnson was the first-team quarterback. John Franklin was the second-team quarterback. And then walk-on Devin Adams played with the third team. Sean White was nowhere to be found. And I still haven't really found or heard anything of where he was at. So I don't know if that's, where we see that maybe he's not in the race, or is just something happened? So Jeremy Johnson, John Franklin, is it a two-man race? Who knows? But you're right. Spring is very important. They got their game this weekend, and we'll see what quarterback turns up with the lights on.
When I think of Nick Marshall's deficiencies at quarterback, I think back to the third or fourth play of the national championship game against Florida State, and they had run the ball well for 3 or 4 plays, and they pulled up for a play action, and he had the kid in the seam wide open, and he just threw the ball into the ground. But at the same time, he was so sleight of hand, and he could make enough throws to get the job done. To Mike's point about the center for the Auburn Tigers, Reese Smukes was one of the better ones in the country, and he was the center for that team that, of course, was running wild against the better defenses in the SEC, and he was one of the big reasons why. And it didn't hurt that they had the second overall pick in the draft at left tackle in Greg Robinson. Ricardo Lewis, moving on, hopefully for him to the NFL, but certainly off campus, and he was the biggest receiving threat for this team last year. Didn't have big numbers, but once they lost Sammy Coates to the NFL, Duke Williams suspended. He was supposed to be replacing Coates and be even a better version of Sammy Coates, and he moved on. Now they lose Ricardo Lewis. The recruiting class and numbers say that the wide receiver core should be in good shape with a lot of young players, but they haven't proven it. So a lot of talented wide receiver, but these guys have yet to get the job done or show us anything actually on the field. All right, it's Auburn, it's Georgia. Of course, they will line up sometime in November again for the longest-running series in the SEC and throughout the South here in 2016, and they have all sorts of questions needing to fill starting at the quarterback position. So, guys, I think we've done enough damage for a Wednesday night. Mike LaValle on your right. We got David Waters as well, and a lot of big plans for our platform coming up in the next coming weeks and months. But for right now, SEC Breakdown comes your way every Wednesday night, 9 o'clock Eastern and 8 o'clock Central. So we will see you again next week. Guys, thanks so much again.
See you later.
Thank you.